Hey everyone, welcome to Retire with Style. I'm Alex. I'm here with Wade, and we have a reoccurring guest that I'll let Wade do the honors on.
Thanks, Alex, and thank you, David Blanchett. We're very welcome, very happy to have you back for another episode. Dr. David Blanchett, PhD, is the managing director and head of retirement researcher for PGIM DC Solutions, and he's a very active retirement researcher. I believe it's about 10 years ago, possibly even this month, that we met in person the first time at that Chicago O'Hare Hilton Airport hotel that I always talk about how I flew there from Japan. I never really left the airport facility because the hotel there is connected underground to the O'Hare Airport. So then I flew back to Japan again, but met you in person there the first time, and really had a pleasure to do a lot of research with you over the years, and you've done your own separate research and everything else. And so we're glad to have you here this week to talk about another important topic in retirement planning, which is how to, using software, how to think about building a retirement income plan, matching assets, matching liabilities, putting them all into one particular set of calculations, and seeing how that plan performs and whether someone's comfortable with the plan that they have. And so to start, I think you have some issues with how some of the Monte Carlo-based financial planning software tends to work, but we should probably define, to begin with, what is it that if I go to a financial advisor and they run a financial plan for me and tell me I have a 90% chance for success, what exactly is going on? What does this mean? What are they doing? How are they achieving that type of calculation?
Yeah, so if we go way back, so when I first got in the industry 20 years ago, when you did a financial plan, it was deterministic, right? So you would assume that returns, that stocks go up 6% a year, whatever it was. Okay, very basic. The industry over the last decade or two, I think, has widely shifted towards something called Monte Carlo simulation. It sounds really sexy. I don't really know what it is. You just assume that there's some form of randomness as part of the projection. In theory, you can have lots of random things in a projection. You could have random mortality. You could have health shocks. You could have random retirement dates. But in reality, for the vast majority of tools right now, you have random returns. And now, to be clear, when I say random, it's been pre-specified. You've set assumptions that you're going to use, but you're not going to assume that stocks just go up, say, 8% a year. You're going to assume that stocks go up, stocks go down, and you're going to do different runs or trials. You're going to kind of assume, oh, this is one possible retirement, this is another. And then how it usually works in most tools is you then kind of have a forecast. I want to have $50,000 a year for 30 years. I'm then going to look within all of the different runs or trials, add up how many times I accomplish my goal. So there's 1,000 different runs, and I accomplish my goal in 800 of those. I would have an 80% success rate. So the success rate is focused on effectively a binary outcome. Did I accomplish my goal in its entirety, or did I not? And that is kind of the overwhelmingly most used metric today, at least from what I've seen in financial planning software.
Okay, and so there's an important nuance you said there about, yes, many things are random in retirement. We don't know how long we're going to live. We don't know how much we're going to spend. We don't know whether we might experience a spending shock that requires us to spend more than we budgeted for. We don't know what market returns will be and so forth. But for the most part, financial planning software assumes only the market returns are random. Everything else is fixed in advance, and that includes I'll live to a specific age. Here's the spending I'm going to do every year in retirement. If I'm thinking about a long-term care spending shock, it would have to be specified as exactly what that is. It's not going to be randomly introduced into the simulations or anything like that. And you, as you point out, there's some issues there. What should people be thinking about if I do one of these financial plans? First of all, if I use two different softwares, software A might tell me I have a 95% success rate. Software B might tell me I have a 75% success rate. And so there's some issues. Maybe we should talk about what's causing the differences that people usually see. But then more generally, what are the problems with this type of an approach?
So first, this is I've been working on this for decades. There's so many places to go when it comes to these forecasts. So the first thing that I always say is the forecast is going to be wrong. right? No one knows what's going to happen over the next year, the next 10 years, the next 30 years, right? But we use these forecasts, these models, to help us make decisions on what we should be doing. So like, gosh, how much do I have to save to retire? How much can I spend when I retire? And so I think that it's important that the assumptions that we use, the models that we build, track reality as much as possible. So like one really common assumption in Monte Carlo engines is still today that returns are the same as historical long-term averages, right? And for some reason, everyone always picks U.S. historical returns. So let's just assume that, that going forward, the returns are going to be the same as they've been historically. Now, Wade, I know you did research on this over a decade ago looking at international returns. There's no I get it. It's a convenient thing to do, but it's not very realistic to assume that, if the average yield on government bonds has been 5%, I can earn that today because you can't. So I think that there's so many important assumptions in these models, but a lot of the base assumptions that advisors use are just out of the gate wrong. And, I love talking about this to advisors, and they're like, well, I don't know what's going to happen, so why would I use a forecast return versus historical long-term averages? And the point that I always make is that these aren't going to be correct, but they need to be as correct as we think that they can be. So
it's a better process.
Yeah, you need to use reasonable return expectations. And back when bond yields were 1%, you shouldn't assume you can earn 5% on government bonds. It's just not realistic, right? So out of the gate, that is one. I'll never forget when I was a planner 20 years ago. You would lose clients because you'd be like, hey, you would use better assumptions. You'd say, hey, you should probably plan to live to 95. You should use forecast, and I can't work with you because this other planner, they're going to help me accomplish my goal. I have a higher success rate. Well, yeah, because they're using dumber expectations. It's not a better model. And so I think it's important to distinguish, the quality of a model and the output, and try to understand all these assumptions. And a problem to understand this is that there's all these interlocking assumptions, all these levers that you can pull up and down that have a huge impact on the output of these projections. So I think that they're critically important. You have to have some kind of guidance or information about what you should be doing. The problem is that a lot of the key assumptions, the key outcomes metrics that we use today, I think are just kind of inadequate in terms of kind of helping people make better decisions.
David, are you sure they didn't become a client because of your assumptions, or they just let's just put the obvious out there. They just
why not both? Can we just?
I mean, you didn't continue being an advisor for a reason, right?
Can we just assume it's both,
What do you think, Wade?
I have heard so many advisors. I have heard so many advisors say that they have literally lost clients because they have done a financial plan using forecasted returns. In this dummy across the streets, assuming that stocks go up 12% a year and bonds go up 5.5% a year, and so everything looks awesome, like the Lego movie. But in reality, that's just not a realistic expectation.
No, I get you.
And when you plug in the U.S. historical numbers, something like the 4% rule, if you just test that in the software, it'll report a 94% success rate. Whereas if you account for, interest rates are lower and you can't get an average bond return from a lower interest rate starting point, so you make some adjustments to reflect that reality, the success rate's going down. And as you're pointing out, no, the advisor down the street said I have a 95% success rate. You're telling me 70%.
Yeah.
I think I'll go with the guy down the road. And
so,
unfortunately, that guy down the road is not using good assumptions.
So, I mean, the reality is we can have a whole arc on Monte Carlo, right? Whether you're bootstrapping your whatever sampling size you use, this, that. There's a lot of things here to unpack, to use a word you used in our last sort of visit, David. But in terms of in the theme of this arc, using Monte Carlo from a financial planning standpoint as you're assessing your ability to take retirement income from a budgeting standpoint. There's and you alluded to it in the last time we met. I think the biggest shortfall here, and it's not so much Monte Carlo, but the way it's used, is the focus on success rate as opposed to the other way around, the magnitude of failure. I think that's a huge impactful issue that leads to that underspending over the long term, and not a very fulfilled retirement on a relative basis. I think that's where it's at from a budgeting standpoint, as opposed to you know, the stats part of it.
Yeah. So I mean, I think
Yeah, you came at the,
go ahead. Go ahead.
well, yeah, I mean, just you're talking about this idea that the focus gets entirely put on, I need a high probability of success without really paying much attention to what does it mean to not have success.
Because I think to some extent, clients and advisors, it's almost like that game in Princess Bride with the Greek and Wesley, right? You know that I know that you know that I know that you know that I know. And what I think a client does is, okay, you're going to give me this, but you know what? In addition to that, I'm going to even have my own little side calculation on the side that's going to be more conservative in case you screw up. You know what I mean? So there's always these kind of perpetual circles of overly conservative assumptions to hit 100%. And you need to have, like, you want your portfolio to survive 5 nuclear scenarios, which at that point it's a big who cares. And so yeah, it's that kind of theme. And I think focusing on success rates facilitates that thinking.
Yeah, I mean, so taking a step back, with any kind of model or projection, you need to ask like certain questions. Like, does the model itself does my forecast model reflect what people actually do? Do people blindly take the same amount of money from a portfolio every year plus inflation, no matter what happens?
Yeah.
No. Do people experience
Do they play chicken with the
outcomes?
market?
Is retirement a binary outcome where either I am like just so happy that I accomplished my goal, or I'm miserable? Like, there's no in between with success rates. There's like either I'm a 1 or a 0. So like when you're building portfolios, or you're quantifying things, you have what's called an objective function. Like, what am I trying to maximize, right? And literally, there's just 2 states with success rates. It's a 1 or a 0. Okay, and that totally ignores, well, like, maybe I'm a 0 and I didn't accomplish my goal, but I literally fell $1 short in the 35th year of retirement. Okay, so that's actually like a 0.9999999, but you can't capture that using success rates. And so what worries me is that, one, success rates, again, assume an entirely fixed goal. And to your point earlier, Alex, it ignores the magnitude of failure, right? Every American effectively has some form of guaranteed lifetime income. Okay, that provides a floor. Okay, a question that's really important is how much of your non-discretionary, your inelastic, your needs, there's lots of your essential expenses does that cover? Right? Then you have your savings. Your savings is always marginal. What is that doing for you in terms of providing income? It could be that you get all that you need covered from your guaranteed income. Then the role of the portfolio is dramatically different in that environment than if it's covering most or all of your kind of non-discretionary expenses. And success rates, by definition, cannot capture that. And so what worries me is it can give very bad advice around things like, how much risk you should take, how much you have to save, how much you can spend, should I buy guaranteed income? Because it doesn't capture, if you fall short, how short you fall across all these projections and models.
Wait.
Right, and so kind of something that came up that's related to this point too, people won't play this game of chicken. They'll adjust their spending. There's a whole literature about variable spending strategies, and there's a limitation. And I don't know if at this point maybe some software has figured that out, not that I'm aware of. For the most part, no financial planning software can incorporate a dynamic strategy where you adjust something, whether it's spending or something else, based on how that simulated Monte Carlo simulation for that particular scenario is going, so that if that scenario gives you some down market years, there's no commercial software that can say, okay, let me cut my spending a little bit and see how that would impact the overall financial plan. And that we have the research because we can program that sort of thing, so we can look at that type of dynamic spending strategy. But it's something that just can't be done with commercial financial planning software.
I would disagree with your statement. It can be done.
There's someone who's got it now?
What's that?
Someone has done it?
Someone is building it as we speak. I think the problem
is it available now? Or?
Not currently. But I think the problem
okay, well.
is, so the thing is, it's not that it can't be done. Okay, the problem is
No, it can't. It certainly
yeah.
can be done.
Well, but the problem is the
because
vast
we do it in our own research.
well, yes, but the problem is that the vast majority of dynamic models are unsuitable to be used in an actual financial plan, given things like uncertain cash flows and calculation timing. So the vast majority of models exist kind of in a bubble. And so what you have to have is what I'll call like a cohesive series of models that one, you can iteratively adjust withdrawals in retirement based upon preferences and situation, like a unique objective function that then captures how things evolve. But like is when you introduce dynamic withdrawals into a model, one, most models can't do it because they can't incorporate uneven cash flows. So I retire at 65, I claim Social Security at 70, I get a DIA kick in at 85. Very few models can actually incorporate future instances of cash flows into the actual current decision today, right? Then on top of that, even once you solve that, it requires a different outcomes metric, because if you all of a sudden then adjust withdrawals, figure out how you're going to adjust them over time, and then it changes your outcomes metric. All of a sudden success rates no longer work, right? Because like, what are you actually accomplishing?
Yeah.
So the problem is it not only do most existing models not work, it breaks the outcomes metric that the vast majority of planners use today.
Right. You cannot use a probability of success with a variable spending strategy.
Right.
And so the software that eventually provides this sort of dynamic spending would need to adjust.
So that gets to like this notion of like there's diagnostic metrics about like how you're doing this, and there's outcome metrics. How do you, in a very salient manner, relay how on track someone is to accomplish their goal, right? So again, like success rates have become the prominent metric, and I mean I don't like them, but I like the fact that they incorporate uncertainty. You're providing some context around, well, you're not necessarily guaranteed to accomplish a goal. The problem, right, is that it isn't necessarily very useful, right? Like you could have a 0% success rate and be on track to replace like 88% of your goal in virtually all simulations. Mm-hmm. And so that there's a huge disconnect there, right? And so I think to me that's the problem is that it doesn't track how individuals would actually respond to environments or how they would feel about different outcomes, because it's a binary metric.
Yeah, and ultimately it gives you that probability distribution of outcomes and lets you eyeball what you feel most comfortable with. Because something like a magnitude of failure can certainly be incorporated. Alex and I we built out a software program together 10 years or so ago where we did have the magnitude of failure in there as a metric.
But we didn't have the dynamic stuff like David's fancy software now.
Well, we did in the safe savings rate module. It just never got moved over to the main.
Oh yeah, we do have the safe savings rate module.
So
You're
I mean,
right.
I guess what I'm pushing for is a movement. I think that goal completion is a much more useful statistic. You can actually do it in most frameworks today. So right now what you have is Monte Carlo / stochastic models that assume static spending. That's okay, right? But as opposed to telling someone that you have a 47.35% chance of success, I think that a more useful outcome metric would be that at age 95, in the worst 1 in 10 outcomes, you're going to accomplish 78% of your goal. Right, so focus on part of the distribution. Use the existing tools we have, but give someone more context around how they're doing versus like this. You're in or you're out.
I think telling someone they can accomplish 78% of their goal at a certain age is 100% correct. I think you're spot on. Sorry, Wade.
As you're saying, I mean that technology exists now. There's nothing stopping any commercial financial planning software program from providing that information.
Every tool, I think if we move to goal completion, that would be a radical improvement in how individuals perceive outcomes. And that's not difficult. That is literally just picking a percentile within a series of runs, picking an age, and showing someone that. That's easy. I do still believe.
Yeah, the calculations they've done have that information.
By definition.
How they
I think the dynamic thing is actually is really important because your willingness to revisit a decision in the future can radically just as you iterate through it creates like cones or tulips, whatever you want to call them. It could change what you would do today. So if you an advisor would say, well, yeah, I'm going to go in next year and make this adjustment. But I mean, Wade, you've modeled this too. That if you're going to go in and make that change in the future, it can increase the withdrawal you're going to take out today. Right, so it can have a very, should I allocate to guaranteed income and all that. And so I think that to me, there's just all these things that we should be doing. Dynamic withdrawals, decomposing the retirement liability into like needs and wants, different outcomes metrics. I think that directionally we've made progress in terms of the use of Monte Carlo, but the outcomes metrics haven't changed in like 30 years, which is
Yeah, I think you're going to have problems with that because from a logistic standpoint, I agree with everything you're saying, but okay, a software, unless you do a de novo, a software provider for them to do something, there's a certain cost embedded in it, and if the advisors aren't really asking for this feature, I just don't think they're going to do it because it becomes a business question. Well, it's going to cost me X amount of money to develop something that has that feature, and only 2% of advisors that are using this program are going to use that. I'm not going to do it.
so.
I think you get a lot of that. I suspect based on your facial reaction, you're going to counter, but I just don't see it. Unfortunately,
But this actually
being applied, it should.
The earlier conversation, that guy can get you a 4% withdrawal. I can get you a 5% withdrawal, and I can show you why you're going to get it because so again, like to your point, this is all stuff that that we geek out about that I'm not sure that anyone else really cares about, but it is driving the decisions that advisors and households make. So there are low lifts. A low lift is to move to goal completion versus success rates. I think it's incredibly important that we as an industry structurally longer term incorporate dynamic withdrawals to give better context about how spending is likely to evolve as you make changes versus just seeming kind of like a fixed goal throughout retirement.
Wait. We record these podcasts on video, and Wade just did the unthinkable. He leaned over and he picked up one of his books, and he's looking through the pages. So
I was
watch out.
The name of it. I mean, the point David just made, if I recall, we saw that in the titles of past research articles of, let me tell you how you can spend more. Oh, yeah. But Jonathan Guyton's first article on the decision rules was, decision rules and portfolio management for retirees is the safe initial withdrawal rate too safe. And that's exactly the point. That if you're willing to cut spending in the future, you can use a higher initial withdrawal rate. And therefore, that's exactly your point that now we have a new way to rate's higher than the guy down the street.
Position too that we academics that do research for living use utility functions, not success rates. I think that magnitude of failure is a good way to do it. You can actually overlay utility out metrics, if you decompose the liability. And I think that there's ways you can actually do this that are very friendly towards you can create outcomes metrics that are actually very friendly to retirees that are much more complicated. I think that we've
Can you describe utility function just for since you threw it out there, just for our listeners? It could be conceivably some folks don't know what that means.
You're just assigning numerical values to how happy something makes you. So one could argue that success rates have a utility function. It's 1 or 0. 1, I accomplish my goal. 0, I don't. Okay, that's your utility function. Okay, well, you could say actually if I accomplish my goal and have a surplus, I'm going to get a 2. If I accomplish my goal and just barely do, I've got a 1, and if I fall short by this, I've got a 0.5. So it's just what you're trying to do is just quantify in a more granular fashion, or however fashion you want, how an outcome's going to make me feel. And so I think the key is with utility functions in general is that you capture the array of outcomes at a much finer level of granularity. There's all types of curves that you can use. The key is it's not a binary state. It's not I'm happy or I'm angry.
Yeah, it's not pass or fail. So if I'm going to try to say something in this sense, I think I have it, but I just give me your blessing, if you will. So if you do it just based on the probability of success, that's either you pass or fail. If you look at it within the utility function, you can incorporate within the pass or fail, in addition to that, the magnitude of failure, the other kind of wrinkles that provide a better context towards a more fulfilling retirement.
Yes. And it makes it not linear so that as your legacy or as your spending gets higher and higher, you're happier, but at a decreasing rate so that you put more emphasis on protecting yourself in bad scenarios. You worry less about assigning a lot of weight when the scenarios are very good. And the more risk averse you are, the more emphasis you put on the bad.
Yeah, there's a marginal utility to the surplus.
And so where does this where this also matters is when you think about your retirement goal, it's let's assume you just have needs and wants. Okay, well, a shortfall in a wants is I derive less disutility from that than I would if I have a shortfall in my needs. And so then, two, what it allows you to do is kind of, create a better utility function or perspective on if there is a shortfall, how does that affect me as a person, right? And so that could then change, like, do I allocate to guaranteed income? How much can I spend? All of that can like radically change when you have a kind of I think a better approximation of not only the retirement liability, but then also the outcome metric you use to kind of quantify it.
We would talk about consumption smoothing, but since you already mentioned utility functions, we can't do both of those in one episode. It's not possible. No, but David, in terms of the Monte Carlo, there's a quick point because we're kind of like, we're kind of cracking on it for sport at this point. Would you say you throw it out, or there is some? Okay, I agree. I just want there's some advisors listening to it, and sometimes I've heard consumers when we're talking to them, especially the folks on Retirement Researcher, they're quick to dismiss Monte Carlo. We're not trying to bury it. We're just trying to make sure it's used within the proper context is all, and what interpretation can be the most effective. At least that's my take on that. Would you agree with that?
One comment I make is one thing I don't want to smack advisors, but they're like Monte Carlo assumes normal distributions for returns, and I'm like, hold on.
Yeah, exactly. I can't stand that. That drives me absolutely bonkers. But go on.
First off, Monte Carlo can do anything. You could literally model anything in Monte Carlo. Your tools that you use maybe can't do that, but you could build the craziest models known to man in Monte Carlo. So I think first off you need to separate the actual ability versus your tool, and then it is an evolution from deterministic forecasts. There are problems with it, and I think that it just needs to evolve. I think the important thing is don't assume that it can't do something. If it can't do it, it's because the tool that you're using can't, not that Monte Carlo itself can't somehow do it.
I think you're being kind. I think those are just folks that don't want to use it to begin with, so they look for a reason, and then they feel kind of like, oh, I did my research. Look, it's not normally distributed. I'm out. Honestly, I think it's as simple as that. But I guess I'm more of a cynic than most.
Well, to take this full circle, too, kind of one issue with Monte Carlo is, you know what the average return is, because that's the input to the calculations, and it has a volatility to that as well. But if I say target a 90% success rate, there's a fixed rate of return assumption that corresponds to that, but the software doesn't report it. You can reverse engineer it because you can look at the cash flow supported at the success rate you're targeting, and then just, what is the return implied that allowed me to have those cash flows? And that requires some effort. But that number might shock people sometimes. Of course, it depends on the assumptions and everything else. But your 90% success rate could possibly correspond to a negative rate of return. It's hard to know. And so I've almost come full circle in some way and said, okay, rather than kind of worrying about a success rate, what if you just decided what rate of return are you comfortable with and did a deterministic plan based on that? And it should not be the average return, because that would correspond to a 50% success rate. But if you did it that way, that might be an easier way to think through the type of problem that you're solving.
Wait, I think what you said warrants, not repeating, but it warrants the folks listening to hit that thing on the podcast that says 30 seconds back, 30 seconds back. Hit it twice and listen to it again, because I think you're spot on, and I think people really miss this. Or they listen to it, it makes sense, but they haven't really gotten the understanding of that. I think what you just said is one of the most important things that this podcast has had, at least right now. And it merits it, and it transitions into the funded ratio, may I say, which is, I think, where you were going with this. And I just wanted to bring it up from an important standpoint. Re-listen to it.
Okay. Well, and in that regard, too, that's when I was writing the retirement planning guidebook. That's really when I started paying more attention to the funded ratio and coming to the conclusion that as an initial retirement plan, why not just use something like that where you don't worry about a success rate, you just control what is the fixed rate of return assumption I'm going to use, and see if the plan is funded in that regard. But it's a parallel universe to Monte Carlo, because with whatever rate of return I assume, there would be a corresponding probability of success. I would just have to reverse engineer that, versus with Monte Carlo, I calculate a probability of success, and if I wanted to know the fixed rate of return, I'd have to reverse engineer that. So
now, in the previous episode, we spoke about funded ratios, and we defined it and everything like that. But with you, David, you may want to talk about a little bit of the work you've been doing and your thoughts on the funded ratio and how that could work in terms of budgeting for retirement
I
income.
mean, the funded ratio is a goal completion metric, right? It fundamentally is telling you how. So funded ratio, it's all assets, balances, and future guaranteed income streams divided by the goal, and so it's very similar operationally. Right. I mean, based upon what you use in terms of discount rates within a model, a funded ratio of 1 might approximate to a 50% success rate. And so I think that to me is a larger question. But, I like them. I like the idea of showing someone effectively like an income map, where you show them, this is, your needs goal, your wants goal. These are how your assets stack up against that. And then maybe that's how you actually allocate your portfolio. So what is the marginal role of the portfolio within how you're funding your retirement goal? Is it focused entirely on needs because you're underfunded? Is it focused on wants and more flexibility? I think like those are the funded ratio concept is very good because it is distilling the assets and liabilities separately, wherein most Monte Carlo tools are kind of conjoined. There's not like necessarily a perspective on how each differs.
Fair enough.
But there's actually really important implications, I think, for the funded ratio, even within like a more stochastic model. I think that it can play a powerful role is both a diagnostic metric as well as like an outcomes metric.
We enjoy it as a starting point for the plan, frankly. We do the RISA, and then the RISA kind of identifies sort of, how this person may want to source retirement income. And then we provide a funded ratio in which we do break it up. There's essential needs, there's discretionary, and we even put a component for reserves. And so we get a global funded ratio. And just to reiterate, if you folks don't want to listen to the previous episode and you just want it quick and dirty, it's just assets over liabilities. The present value of your assets over the present value of your liabilities, right? And then how do you get that present value is what we're referring to as the discount rate, especially for the liabilities portion. But, we do a global one, and then we do one specifically for the discretionary, specifically for the essentials, and then one for the reserves. And then to us, that kind of provides insight when you overlay that with your preferences with regards to retirement style, where you want to focus on, what strategies you want to implement. We think it resonates quite well with folks, and it's not just opinion. I mean, we've done probably 1,000 at this point in our challenges, and the reactions have been great with regards to how it really lays the groundwork for how to move forward. Because you're right. I mean, when I heard you speaking in the previous one, it is that you're right. It's goal completion, in its literal sense, 100%. Wade?
Yeah, and like just personally, my own financial planning, I use the funded ratio. I've never really tried to run my financial plan through a Monte Carlo software program because you've just got more control. And we like to do it in terms of, can your plan work without taking market risk? So let's put in the long-term TIPS yield as the discount rate, which suggests you're investing. It's not saying that you have to invest 100% in TIPS, but if you were to invest 100% in TIPS, does the plan work? And then beyond that, of course, you can decide to take on market risk, but you have more you have a better sense of if you need market risk or how that effectively can fit into the plan, knowing in advance whether market risk is necessary to make the plan work. So that's how we think about it, and it fits into this whole Monte Carlo discussion because a lot of the assumptions are the same. The only difference is I feel like you get better control over those capital market assumptions that you're using, which is where, to the point you made earlier, with this whole conversation around the advisor down the street is offering a higher success rate. Those capital market assumptions are all in tiny print on the last page in a disclosure, and you really lose sight of what's going on there in a way that the funded ratio can help bring that back to the front and center.
Yeah, I mean, to me, there's two really important metrics or just assumptions that affect the outcome of a financial plan. There's the capital market assumptions and how long retirement lasts. So you want to make someone's plan look spectacular, use historical long-term averages, assume they're going to pass away at 90, and you're off the races. Now, I mean, the thing is, the average person won't know why that's a terrible plan for them. The average American that has any kind of savings is going to live a long time, right? If you're a married couple, like 30 years is like the starting point right now. And what worries me is that there's no kind of incentive for advisors to kind of really focus on figuring out what those right assumptions could be. So you layer on, you start with the plan they use. You use crappy assumptions around returns, bad assumptions around how long retirement lasts. You have a bad outcomes metric like success rates, and it's just not necessarily leading to optimal advice. Now, is it better than a pure deterministic forecast? Probably, but it's hard to compare the kind of the efficacy of these plans because they can use vastly different assumptions that the average person has no clue what they should be.
I think you're right. And you were saying before the podcast, we were just talking, and a lot of your work has been going into this right now. Am I correct? Did I misremember that, or am I spot on? I'd love to hear, to the degree that you can speak, and for our audience just to get to know what you do. Just speak about that. I think within the context of the funder ratio, I think it's kind of cool.
Well, I'm trying to become a trophy husband, but that's kind of failed so far. So I'm going to have to keep working. No, so I think that there's a in any environment there's a benefit to personalization, right? So target date funds have been a radical improvement in the defined contribution space versus self-direction. That is unequivocal, right? But the question is, well, could you use information about participants, like their income, their balance, their age, their savings rate, their plan tenure, their marital status, to give them better advice or guidance, right? And so I think that where the industry could be headed is to give personalized portfolios, personalized recommendations in a variety of spaces. We've seen this kind of general growth of robo, and so one thing that I'm working on within Prudential, within PGIM, is just how do you deliver that at scale? Right, so if you wanted to kind of help someone determine what is a more efficient portfolio, a better savings goal, what does that look like? And I think that if you can tell, based on what I've talked about things today, it requires a better model. It requires really thinking through, what the liabilities, what the assets are, and then kind of constructing, more efficient portfolios, providing advice around guaranteed income, whatever it is, based upon that. So I think like the group that I'm a part of, it's a new group within PGIM. Those of you that don't know who PGIM is, it's the asset manager within Prudential. Creating strategies along those lines. So kind of really understanding what retirement is and how do you develop solutions to help folks accomplish better retirement.
Yeah,
It's pretty good.
that sounds like a good place to wrap up for today. But we're very glad you joined us for 2 episodes, and it's great. We've had Michael Finka, one of your close colleagues. Oh, I didn't mention as part of your bio, and probably should. You're also an adjunct professor at the American College of Financial Services. So it's great having you as part of the show.
Check that box.
Thank you so much, and thanks for listening, everyone. Have a great day.
Hey, David, thank you so much. Seriously, it's been a great pleasure, and thanks everyone for listening in. You want to send us off, David?